Yeah, maybe then we just start and you keep letting people in. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our new event of the Bonn Water Network. So for those of you who don't know us yet, the Bonn Water Network consists of 11 renowned institutions with long-standing experience in the water sector. We have UN institutions, we have university institutions, we have NGOs, and yeah, it's quite a wide outreach and a wide expertise. And we're also very happy to exchange with non-members, but we're also, of course, experts on the issue. So we're welcoming GIZ today as our guest. Unfortunately, Eleonora Hoffmann from GIZ can't join us due to illness. We wish her all the best for a quick recovery, but we're very happy to have Robert Kranefeld with us. So today's topic is the nexus between water, energy, food, and ecosystems, the so-called WEFE Nexus. So you can imagine that given all the interactions between these sectors, coherent governance is challenging. So we are therefore very happy to have three inputs that help us better understanding this nexus and how we can best govern it. So my colleague Srinivasa from IDOS will explain the political institutional conditions for coordination based on insights from Ethiopia, Jordan, Malawi, and Mexico. Rebecca Sands from the Water Integrity Network, that are also part of the Bonn Water Network, then explained us how we can address integrity issues in WEFE governance. And finally, Robert Kranefeld from GIZ takes us to the Niger Basin and helps us understanding regional nexus governance, which is probably even more complex since you don't have all these sectors only, but also different countries involved. So I'm very curious to learn more about the topic together with you. We will start with Srini. Srini received his PhD in agricultural economics from the Humboldt University. And then since August 2019, he holds a position as a senior researcher within the research program on environmental governance at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. You may have known us formerly as DIE. Now we are IDOS. So at IDOS, he focuses on water, energy, food nexus under the conditions of climate change in an interdisciplinary research project on the implementation of the 2030 agenda. Prior to joining IDOS, he held a research positions with the International Crops Research Institute for Semi-Arid Tropics in India, and was at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies at Humboldt University Berlin and in Humboldt University Berlin. So beside research, you did several consultancy assignments for various research development and humanitarian organizations. And now the floor is yours to take us to the Nexus governance. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think I'll share my presentation. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, but it's not in presentation mode yet. Yeah, no, it's perfect.
Is it in the presentation mode or is it in the? Yeah, okay, perfect. Then, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Annabelle, for the introduction.
Sorry, it's still not full presentation notes, but we see the,
okay.
the next slide. I think it's Anzeige-Einstellungen on top.
Yeah, I always have this problem. I think that's why I was asking. And I think I need to first. Where do I go? I think
if you go back to the presentation mode, I think it's in the yeah, in the Zoom on top on the under Anzeige-Einstellungen. You see the arrow next to on the top?
I have a completely different view, and this is what.
Yeah, otherwise go ahead with the other mode. We still see it. It's okay.
Now you do not have the presentation mode, right?
No.
Okay, 1 second. I will. And then now? Yeah, now the Anzeige-Einstellungen. And then Bildschirmpräsentation.
Yeah.
Now?
Just waiting. Yeah, perfect. Now we can start. Great.
Okay, wonderful. Sorry for the technical glitch. And thank you, Annabelle, again for the introduction. And thank you, Water Integrity Network, for organizing this very important webinar and allowing me to present some insights from our ongoing work on WEFE Nexus governance, and especially on the role of political institutional conditions in fostering coordination in the Nexus. And I have to say that these insights are based on the work of several colleagues who are also not mentioned here on the slide, who were involved in one or more of these case studies. Now, okay, good. Can you still see the slides? Yeah, no? Yeah, okay. So, as a discourse, we know WEFE Nexus or WEFE Nexus has contributed in reframing the problem of resource governance, where different policies aiming to achieve the societal goals of water, energy, and food security compete with each other for resources. And coordination across different sectors, across different actors or decision-making situations that are spread across different sectors and levels is crucial to minimize trade-offs and achieve synergies in achieving the interlinked societal or policy goals. And furthermore, harmonization of goals and interests involves a process of contestation and negotiations. For a peaceful process of contestation and negotiations, supportive political institutions are proven to be crucial. And besides a conducive political regime, state capacity plays a very crucial role in effective governance of public affairs, and even more so when the governance mechanisms are required to coordinate multiple and complex interdependencies, as we see in the WEFE Nexus interactions. However, so far the scholarship, which was dominated by a technical managerial perspective, does not focus enough on governance and even less on the political institutional conditions that are believed to be influencing the effectiveness of this governance mechanisms of WEFE Nexus. Therefore, we started with the core question of how do political institutions, namely regime type and state capacity, influence coordination in WEFE Nexus. And just before we go into the case studies, it would be important to at least briefly mention where the literature stands on the key concepts being discussed here. Regarding regime type, it is worth noting that in reality, there exists a continuum of regime types between pure democracies to pure autocracies. We also observe that the scholarship is skewed in associating democracies with better incomes, better environmental conditions, and more equality, mostly owing to the features of democracies such as civil liberties, societal participation, and decentralization, etc. However, this is not uncontested, especially with respect to their performance in achieving sustainability outcomes. It is argued that input legitimation via free and fair election creates incentives for democratic governments which favor the preferences and interests of today's citizens who are voting over those of future generations. When it comes to state capacity since the 1990s, there has been a lot of emphasis by the literature on state capacity as being a prerequisite for effective design and implementation of public policies and provision of public services. There are arguments both in favor of the so-called developmental state, characterized by bureaucratic elites with technical skills playing an active and interventionist role in different business sectors, on the one hand, as well as those where the role of state is minimal and the public services are mostly delivered by non-state entities, be it markets or networks and so on. And with not dependence, so to say, independence of the capacities of the state. However, it has been also observed that in the so-called new models of governance, where the state's role is understood to be minimal, state still needs enhanced capacities to deliver its function as a guarantor of even as an arbitrator, where in case of conflicts among different goals, especially social, environmental, and economic goals. So with regards to the coordination mechanisms, there are three typical modes through which coordination is achieved among different actors, namely markets, hierarchies, and networks. that produce different patterns of interactions. For managing the WEFE Nexus interactions, a combination of different patterns of a combination of these different modes of governance may be required. So here we see the type of regime and the capacity of state determine the choice of coordination modes and their choice of coordination modes and their combinations, and again also the choice of policy instruments for achieving these different goals. Now, going into the case studies, in order for us to understand the influence of regime type and state capacity on coordination in the Nexus, we selected 4 countries which differed in their regime type and state capacities. In democracies, we selected Mexico and Malawi, which have medium, high, and low state capacities respectively. For autocracies, we selected Jordan and Ethiopia, which are both moderate autocracies as per the Bartelsman's Transformation Index and with moderate and low state capacities respectively. As we could see here that even though they're democracies, Mexico and Malawi, they are either highly defective or defective democracies. So yeah, so we observed the studies are further centered on selected river basins in these 4 countries for in-depth analysis of WEFE Nexus interdependencies. We observed a diversity of interdependencies in the 4 countries and the river basins we studied, which is further determined by the biophysical, socioeconomic, or political context of these countries. For example, in the Coahuila Basin of Mexico, industrial use of water, mainly for electricity generation, has major trade-offs with irrigation use by smallholder farmers and growing demand for drinking water. Whereas in Azraq Basin in Jordan, we see that unabated withdrawal of groundwater by the heterogeneous group of farmers limits the use of water for maintaining the ecosystem services of a wetland Ramsar site in the region, and also the drinking purposes of urban inhabitants. In Malawi's Tomasi River Basin, which was considered for the study, the main conflict is between the unsustainable sourcing of biomass from the catchment areas to satisfy the energy demand of the local population and the resulting reduction of water availability for smallholder irrigation use and even drinking and household use, as well as other livelihood activities such as fisheries. In the Ethiopian Awash Basin, the main conflict was between the large-scale state and private farms that benefit from medium and large-scale irrigation schemes, and smallholder farmers and pastoralists who live off communal and small-scale irrigation schemes. Now, we take a closer look at the coordination mechanisms and influence of political institutions. First, looking at the democratic context, we find both similar and different conditions constraining coordination among different sectors and levels for ensuring web securities. In both Mexico and Malawi, we find that the water governance is highly fragmented, with coordination and conflict resolution mechanisms either absent or ineffective. In the Mexican case, for example, the decentralization of responsibility of basin councils is not accompanied by power or autonomy to make decisions. Resources were not allocated to key sectors such as environment, which is crucial for balancing among social, ecological, and economic dimensions of sustainability. This is found to be leading to economic growth and private sector priorities taking precedence over social and ecological goals. In terms of political institutional conditions influencing this situation, we found that majoritarian decision-making in the case of large-scale infrastructural projects and policy paradigm of national energy security, which is leaning more towards the fossil fuel dependence, are more major influences of the current situations. In the Malawian context, we saw the political economy factors leading to prioritization of populist schemes such as fertilizer subsidy or farm input subsidies program over other crucial investment areas such as strengthening sectoral capacities, especially water and energy at the subnational levels. This is rendering the key legislations in the sectors of water, especially in sectors of water governance, ineffective. And coordination mechanisms in autocratic systems. Looking at Jordan from a water governance perspective, a stable domestic water supply is a priority for Jordan, but law enforcement is undermined by a strong agricultural lobby. At the same time, cross-sectoral coordination is poor. Agricultural land and energy governance partly provide perverse incentives to over-extract groundwater by encouraging olive tree plantations or subsidized solar water pumps, both of which contribute to further extraction, further depletion of groundwater. The Highlands Water Forum, which is a multi-stakeholder platform, which is supported by donors, meant for cross-sectoral coordination, was not effective in realizing its purpose. The important reasons for the current water use behavior lie within the social political context of Jordan. Jordanian monarchy is based on an implicit social contract where the king provides influential social groups, historically the tribes, with privileges and rents, including water and the public with basic services for their loyalty. The relatively high capacities of the state allowed for using remote sensing for water billing, but that is not leading to a desirable change of behavior. Rather, the influential farmers, some farmers who are not influential are dropping out of farming, whereas the other influential farmers are able to get rebates by better negotiating and through protests and so on. Whereas in case of Ethiopia, the hierarchical mechanisms are effective in translating the federal laws into regional laws, but without representing the interests of the local governments and communities. We see that land expropriation and conversion from rain-fed pasture to commercial and large-scale irrigated agriculture are seen as an important entry point for economic growth. Pastoralists were not compensated for lost rights on the communal grazing land. With regards to water governance, there is a conflict over who has the authority to issue water permits among the basin authorities, federal authorities, and regional authorities. Further, it is not clear how well the environmental legislations are integrated into other sectoral departments. For example, the EIA was not clear whether it was binding over other ministries or licensing authorities and so on. So there were also no clear operational rules for implementing the environmental and social impact assessment. And the autocratic regime of Ethiopia constrains the participation of subnational and non-state actors in planning and implementing various development policies and programs. Further, low state capacities were unable to guarantee the provisions of environmental legislations and scale up the initiatives of registration and certification of communal land rights of pastoralists, which would have been very crucial for ensuring the social goals in Ethiopia. So, in order to conclude, we found that hierarchical decision-making prevails alongside network-style governance mechanisms, whereas in forms of basin councils in Ethiopia, Malawi, and Mexico, and Highlands Water Forum in Jordan, but which have been compromised by sectoral governance regimes, which function in a more top-down hierarchical manner in all the cases. And we find that while democratic conditions allow for greater role of non-state actors, they are not clearly a sufficient condition for effective governance of interdependencies, as majoritarian and political economy-driven decisions put long-term sustainability at risk. State capacity plays a role in policy enforcement and funding at the subnational level, but is not used in our cases to foster ecological sustainability and social inclusion. Although rational management of limited state capacity was emphasized right in Agenda 21, it has so far been neglected, by state policies and reforms and so on. So autocratic conditions were found to lead to even shorter planning cycles, as we've seen in Jordan and Ethiopia, which reinforce centralized policy making and silo thinking in sectoral lines. So with that, I end my presentation, and thank you very much once again for the opportunity.
Thank you a lot. Thank you, Srini, for taking us around the world on Nexus governance. We have a wider debate, a public debate also with all of your inputs, dear public, later on. But I got a question of understanding, which I would maybe quickly ask you. So someone asked me, how do you measure governance efficiency? in your study. Maybe you could briefly elaborate on that, and then we'll go on to the next presentation.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's it's unfortunate that I just mentioned as WGI. I think while selecting, we had a pool of countries. We had like a set of 9 criteria, including water scarcity, out of which governance effectiveness was one, and then we considered the World Bank governance indicators as one of the indicators. I think we mentioned some values in the slide. As effectiveness of governance. We took them for selecting our countries, for case countries. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think there's a lot of food for thought and a lot of questions will arise, but we keep them for later. I now welcome Rebecca. Rebecca Sands is a program officer and WEFE project lead at the Water Integrity Network in Berlin. You're a gender and social exclusion officer at WIN and responsible for facilitating WIN's global, regional and national networks, as well as conducting advocacy, research and program implementation on the link between gender, social inclusion and water integrity. So Rebecca has a background in environmental policy and has focused on governance, policy research and analysis, project management and stakeholder engagement in water, energy, climate and conservation sectors. So englobing all these WEFE issues across different organizations, IGOs, NGOs and the private sector. Rebecca, good to have you. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Annabelle. Yeah, so today I'll be talking a little bit about what the Water Integrity Network is doing to develop an integrity framework for the WEFE Nexus. So first slide, please. Yeah, to start, we're in a global water crisis, and there are some critical weaknesses that are allowing the water crisis to continue. The first is that the governance of water is not effective, and the capacity of governments and institutions to resolve water problems is hampered by fragmented responsibilities and competing interests. There's aging and inadequate infrastructure. Investment is estimated at around $6.7 trillion required globally by 2050 to renew and upgrade sanitation infrastructure. And on top of these challenges, there's also corruption and a lack of integrity threatening the sector, any sector where money and power are at stake, and water in particular is such a sector where such challenges are particularly affecting the poor and disenfranchised, and they are most affected given the nature of the resource. Next slide, please. So to respond to these challenges, the Water Integrity Network champions integrity in the water and sanitation sectors to reduce corruption risks and to improve service delivery. So our aim is to help realize the human rights of water and sanitation and ensure the sustainable use of water resources in the face of climate change and other threats. So we do so by advocating for political and social action, raising awareness of the benefits of an integrity and training stakeholders. We also encourage collective action and multi-stakeholder processes, connecting actors and enabling knowledge sharing and learning between these actors. And we also promote evidence-based responses to poor integrity, and we assess and research risks and develop solutions and mitigation strategies at different levels. Next slide, please. So what exactly do we mean by integrity? Because it's a word that can mean something different for many different people. So at WIN, we really mean that integrity is using vested powers and resources ethically and honestly to ensure services and resources go where they intended and most needed. So integrity is a crucial component of good governance, and it's about achieving equity and sustainability in the water, energy, food, and ecosystem sectors in this context. It's an aspirational goal as well, where the public interest and honesty and fairness override any desire for personal gain. So in the WEFE sectors, it has substantial social, economic, and environmental benefits, and it can improve services to people who need them. It can ensure resources are used more fairly and effectively, and address the root causes of issues, and it boosts and unites efforts to achieve the SDGs while building trust among stakeholders. So practically, what this means is that integrity is done by building up what we call the TAPA framework, which is transparency, accountability, participation, and anti-corruption. So transparency is really about access for everyone to the relevant information that concerns them and the decisions that will be taken that affect their lives. Accountability is about responsive institutions and individuals who understand and fulfill their responsibility and who can be sanctioned when this is not happening. And participation is really at the most basic level, people being involved in the decisions that affect their lives, and all stakeholders being meaningfully involved. Next slide, please. On corruption, we take usually the Transparency International definition of corruption, which is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. So anti-corruption is efforts to obviously mitigate this. And then just quickly, 3 other terms that are relevant for today's discussion is that of inclusion, which is the authentic and meaningful involvement of those who have been traditionally excluded from processes and activities and decision making, and including them in a way that shares power. Obviously, governance and of course good governance, which is among other things participatory, transparent, accountable, effective, and equitable. Next slide, please. So when thinking about what exactly is the WEFE Nexus and how does water fit in, so integrated water resources management, it's normally starting with the water resource when considering these relationships between water, food, energy, and ecosystem, whereas the Nexus approach is really looking at all of these different elements as an interrelated system. So the Nexus approach is holistic and integrated in order to secure a just and sustainable access to water, energy, food, and while also protecting ecosystems now and in the future. Next slide, please. So just here you can see how interrelated these sectors are, how they're feeding into each other, which highlights this massive need for a systematic WEFE Nexus approach. Just as an example, agriculture accounts for about 70% of total global freshwater withdrawals. The energy sector accounts for about 10 to 15% of global freshwater withdrawals. Agriculture and the food chain account for 33% of global energy demand. So these sectors are constantly feeding off of each other and therefore requires a systematic approach. Next slide, please. So therefore, with support from GIZ, WIN has been working to address integrity in the WEFE Nexus to really strengthen how integrity is included in Nexus dialogues and approaches. Because the planning and allocation of water are such crucial early stage decisions, and they're such a diverse set of stakeholders with different dynamics, different priorities that are engaged in these processes, and within these governance frameworks, there's the potential for significant integrity and corruption risk, precisely due to the nature of the approach, because there are all these interdependencies between sectors, there are trade-offs, there are synergies, there are conflicting interests and needs, there's a massive need for cooperation between all actors, and the approach provides these governance solutions to respond to an array of challenges. So therefore, the project is really working to address governance and integrity concerns within the WEFE Nexus approach to make these processes more efficient and effective, and to help attract Nexus-related investments, and to really help these stakeholders start to address integrity from the onset and be able to integrate it into every stage of a Nexus initiative. Next slide, please. So what we have done is developed an integrity framework for the WEFE Nexus. And what the framework does is it outlines the main areas within the establishment and the operationalization of WEFE Nexus projects, building on this TAPA framework that I've just mentioned in previous slides, as well as the WEFE Nexus principles, of which there are 10 principles. So altogether, built on that, we've come up with a 4 I's framework, including institutional, information, investment, and implementation in WEFE Nexus projects. So within this, overarching risks were identified for each area, each of these 4 I areas, as well as overarching tools presented to address these risks. And altogether, this outlines the main integrity elements that need to be incorporated within WEFE Nexus projects and searches. Next slide, please. So here you can see this is just an example of how the framework is being created. So here we have the 4 categories, and within each category there have been overarching risks identified. And if you go to the next slide, Kostub, you can see here we'll take institutional as an example, of which 2 overarching risks were identified. So one here, unbalanced weighing of WEFE sectors and decision-making processes, and indicative risks that were identified in order to address these overarching risks. Here we can see the example of 3 indicative risks. For example, regulatory capture, undue political influence, and private sector seeking opposing outcomes to those of the WEFE Nexus. Next slide, the same for the overarching tools. Here we have the 4 categories, as well as overarching guidelines that are applicable to each category. And in the next slide, you can again see an example of the category of institutional, which overarching guidelines need to be applied in that category, and the indicative tools that can be used to achieve that guideline. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps, as I mentioned, these integrity guidelines are currently being developed. And with this guideline, we're really trying to create the rationale and the framework to ensure integrity and for stakeholders to be able to practically use this guide to put framework to use when developing at the inception phase, at the implementation phase, throughout the entire cycle. The identified WEFE-related integrity risks and tools will also be incorporated into WIN's body of tools. We do a lot to develop relevant tools in order to improve integrity throughout different processes, and so these risks and tools will most likely be developed into a tool to assist in early stage planning as part of our climate portfolio. And a policy brief will be developed to contextualize the final integrity guidelines and provide a way in for those who are interested in engaging in the process. So I will stop there and thanks a lot and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for this overall presentation. Before we go over to the next debate, just to make it a bit more concrete for me, who has not dealt yet with the water integrity issues a lot, could you, I mean, you're working around the world, and yeah, you surely have seen many cases. So could you give us a few examples of corruption in the Nexus and how this can be addressed or prevented?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can take many different forms. I think a lot of that has to do with the priorities of different sector stakeholders. But for example, some of the risks outlined could include, you know, like I said, private sector having opposing interests, and that can lead to perhaps undue lobbying, unfair competition, or regulatory capture. There can be, for example, you know, bid rigging or procurement issues, which can be outright examples of corruption. It can be undue political influence in decision making. So there are a range of different ways in which integrity failures and outright corruption can lead to well, in essence, a Nexus initiative or a Nexus project not achieving what it's meant to achieve, and mistakes form in many different ways.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so sure we can dig deeper later on, because we also have many participants from around the world, so we'll be happy to hear about their experience. But now we first go to the Niger Basin with Robert Kranfeld from GIZ. So Robert is the Regional Nexus Coordinator for the Niger Basin in support of the Niger Basin Authority based in Niamey, Niger. The basin comprises 9 countries in West Africa and is home to more 160 million people. Previously, Robert worked as a political consultant with GIZ to the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development on the topic of water and climate change, with a particular focus on climate change adaptation and resilience. Robert studied in Germany, France, and Canada, and holds an MA in Geographies of Globalization from the University of Frankfurt and a Bachelor in Geography from the University in Münster. Robert, you are overviewing this program from Cologne, but I imagine you also spend a lot of time in the basin itself. So we are very eager to hear your experience on this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Annabelle. Welcome words. Thanks a lot for having me as a guest today. Do you see my presentation correctly as it should be? Great. Yeah, so I first need to apologize for my colleague Eleonora, who should usually give first kind of introduction to the overall program that we're working in. And I will take care of this as well, and then lead you a bit to the Niger Basin. So the program we're working in as GIZ, kind of a global program co-financed by the European Union, the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and we're working in 5 regions that I'll show later on as well. So first, thanks as well to the other speakers to providing the floor on what is Nexus, what is WEFE, and where does it come from. And actually our program is now under the heading, it's the second phase, from theory to practice, and I hope I can bring now some practice to it. But so the history of WEFE is, as a secret developed, I mean, has a long history, and there are a lot of elements of IWM that then influence as well the WEFE Nexus thinking. And this program as well has its orientation from, on the one hand, the World Economic Forum publication on the water security, the water, food, energy, climate nexus. And then, of course, there was the Bonn conference, and I think good to mention maybe in the Bonn Water Network. So the Bonn conference in 2011 kind of was the keystone to this program, which developed the concept paper, which is still influential as well for our work on the concept of the WEFE Nexus. In the program, we still use the term WEFE Nexus, though in kind of its conception as well, we always have the environmental part as kind of the core to the 3 sectors: water, energy, food. So we now tend as well in our ongoing work more and more use the full name WEFE Nexus, just to make the environmental part more explicit to the connection to the 3 other sectors. And the first phase began in 2016, identifying how the WEFE Nexus approach could be established in several regions. And now in kind of second phase, we're more like this from theory to practice, are institutionalizing this approach with our different political partners, and are identifying projects, investments that might be interested for further financing. So in total, we're working in these 5 regions. 3 of them are implemented by GIZ. This is namely Latin America in cooperation with CEPAL. It is the MENA region in cooperation with the League of Arab States, and the Niger Basin in cooperation with the Niger Basin Authority. And then this program works as well in Central Asia with CAREC, and the SADC region implemented by Global Water Partnership. And all kind of these 5 regions try to implement a similar approach, working on demonstration projects, investment, facilitating investment dialogues, and having policy dialogues. But what we realize as well, context matters a lot. So actually the approaches differ a lot when it really comes to the implementation on the ground. And I will then present a bit more on the experience we have with the Niger Basin Authority. Quickly, this is kind of the team of the Global Nexus Secretariat, trying to pull all the strings together from the 5 regions, and providing as well communication work as well, working closely now with WIN on this WEFE transparency guidelines. So there has been this exchange. And so, as I said, context matters. Depending on the different regions, the approaches differ a lot. So For instance, in the SADC region, the Niger Basin region, we really have this more regional approach, trying to work across country, having frameworks to get the political conditions together, and then see how such regional cooperation can be put down to a national level. In the MENA region, it's more, the work is more focused on a national level than again. So there are, of course, different countries involved, but our approach there is more to look at the different national conditions, national frameworks, and how in these settings then the WEFE approach can be realized. And then this is a bit true for all 5 regions. There are always some local approaches, so like local demonstration projects where we look how can now technologies be used to really create synergies between the different sectors, like for instance having a Nexus farm technology. And this all kind of comes together then to a more global Nexus narrative. So if you want to be updated and learn more about the different approaches, you're invited to be at the waterenergyfood.org website. Follow us as well on Twitter and Facebook. And with this, still me, I'm happy to take you to the Niger Basin. I've seen as well my colleague Lisa Ibrahim as well here in the call. I can as well maybe add in the end to questions that come up. So in the Niger Basin, we're working with the Niger Basin Authority, and Annabelle said this comprises 9 countries. The Niger Basin is the third largest river in Africa, the largest basin in West Africa. And there's a long history as well to the Niger Basin Authority. It was first established as the Niger River Commission already in the 60s, then in the 80s transferred to the Niger Basin Authority. And actually in the term already, in the first convention of the Niger Basin Authority, it really becomes clear it's not anymore only about managing water resources, but in kind of the key objective of the Basin Authority, as they already announced in 1981, it is about developing the basin in the context of food, water management, energy provision, navigation. So all the sectors actually, or many of the key sectors are mentioned in this convention. So from the beginning, we could see that actually Nexus makes a lot of sense as a guiding approach. And this is kind of how, for the second phase, there was this vision, okay, how can we now really make most of the approach as we are working with all these kind of key sectors. And if you look at the population that is living in the basin, so about 160 million, insecurity regarding water and energy and food is quite a high topic. And it's quite mostly the same people that are experiencing insecurity regarding water are the same that experience this insecurity regarding energy supply and particularly food security. So there as well, there's a great connection of these topics here. Then how did we work on kind of towards a paradigm shift coming for more this IOM approach to a Nexus approach? As I said, there was a first phase already started in 2018. This was about analyzing how our projects and program developed so far by the Niger Basin Authority. And whenever I say Niger Basin Authority, it's mainly the projects that are brought in by the member states, member countries. And out of this analysis, there were first recommendations drawn that now served us to develop a kind of guideline document. This work was done in cooperation with the University of Ottawa, who supported us in kind of developing these guidelines as well in supporting dialogue event that we had. And then there's a lot of back and forth actually kind of in developing such a document. So the document was presented on a regional level to the Niger Basin Authority first, to representatives of the member states, and then kind of presented at national workshops in all 9 member states. And these workshops are not just about the document, but about the full process. So this included trainings and analysis of demonstration projects as well. Out of these 9 national workshops. We got recommendations, remarks. All these were then taken into consideration again, presented again to a national and regional expert committee. This was beginning of September in Benin, and now there's a final draft version which is ready for recommendation to the Council of Ministers, which hopefully takes place at the end of this month. It had to be rescheduled due to political issues in some of the countries. But so far, I can present a very, very finalized version, which is already approved by all regional experts. So just one look back. So as I said, we had these kind of 1 week, 3-day workshops. On the bottom, you see one element of the training. Here we used kind of a board game simulation developed by IASA and the Center for System Solutions. It's a really interesting WEFE Nexus game, and we used it in all countries to sensitize decision makers from the different ministries about the allocation of resources. And so in total, kind of in this way, we reached out to over 300 participants. And if you see the range of participants, you can see it's still dominated by the water sector. It is a basin organization, but going to the countries allowed us to really get as well a high participation from the other sectors and have discussions among the different stakeholders. And then on the top, you see the picture from this regional expert meeting, which took place in Benin and Cotonou this September, where then the final recommendations were again reviewed by representatives of all 9 countries and the NBA. So now a short view on kind of this document that we developed. I always hope to underline, it's not all about institutionalization. It's not all about a single document, but of course, the document is how some work materializes as well. And so just maybe quick synthesis of this work. We always needed to kind of distinguish between Nexus and then, of course, the WEFE Nexus, saying that particularly in this region, if you just talk of Nexus, there are a lot of other Nexus that might be important. For instance, the humanitarian aid and development Nexus, or climate change conflict Nexus, or conflict, COVID, and health Nexus. So this is kind of a first general definition we always have. And then if you look on the right-hand side, this is the definition that we particularly used, which now the NBA developed actually for their context. So there is a lot of input from their side. And I think there's some elements from CK's input that you can find here as well. And it reflects quite good what is really the interest of such an organization in using Nexus approach. So on the one hand, it's about an interest to improve future projects, improving the design, the conception of future projects and programs. In this sense, the second objective, kind of trying to have with a single intervention to reach out to multiple objectives. A multi-purpose dam is a classic example of one intervention who reached out to several sectors. And actually, multi-purpose dams is still one of the biggest topics for the Niger Basin Authority. Closely related to this is, of course, then the objective to prevent negative intersectoral impacts. So, and here we have it on different levels. On the one hand, of course, it's as well about preventing negative transboundary impacts, but now add this anchor on top, intersectoral impacts. On the other hand, then try to see if there are interventions that are taking place at different locations, how can their synergies maybe even be realized between the ecosystem and the upstream country and any, or take it out the other way around, any irrigation scheme in an upscale country, and then how might this affect or at best case create synergies for larger ecosystem downstream. And finally, of course, a great objective for the NBA is by this facilitating financing and kind of reach out to new investors. So this is kind of now the general structure. I don't go into details of the chapters in general. this document is developed in a way which is similar to existing documents, particularly a water charter that the NBA established in 2008 and 5 annexes. So it follows a bit similar structure. Maybe just to highlight some of the articles that are written here. In Article 5, which is called General Principles, there are many kind of principles that are already established within the context of the Niger Basin Authority. Many of them have a background from IWM, and many of them kind of are relevant as well for WEFE context. So this is kind of what is already there. And then there's another article, Article 6, which then tries to add what should be mentioned in the specific context of the WEFE concept. For instance, prioritizing synergetic projects. This is kind of formulated now as a principle that should be considered in the future of the development of projects. There's one chapter regarding roles and responsibilities. Here maybe it is to mention the idea was not to create any new institution or sub-organs within the authority, but more to see, okay, what kind of organs and institutions are already there, and what should be their role now in implementing a WEFE Nexus approach. For instance, there are already a lot of national structures that have the responsibility to link between the different sectors, and these are now have specific role in implementing the WEFE Nexus. Finally, 2 articles maybe to mention. This guideline now suggests 2 evaluation tools. One's quite simplified, it's more qualitative tool, trying to identify synergies and trade-off between different interventions. It is meant that kind of every policymaker should be able to do such a first evaluation. And then there's a kind of second methodology, which is a bit more data-based, quantitative, done by modeler, who could then really try to identify what might be potential impacts of this approach. So to sum it up, finally, what are kind of some lessons learned, and this could be then lead us as well to the discussion. One challenge we have if we're working with 9 member states and large institutions, there's always a fluctuation among key stakeholders. And so whenever we said, okay, we're working till 2018, at every meeting, somebody said, this is a complete new approach. I've never heard about this. So it's always taking 1 step back and then 2 forward to really take everybody on this kind of journey. The same is having a document with 9 member states signed. There are different interpretations in the end. Agreeing on strong language on every point is maybe the initial version suggested by the University of Ottawa is not now the final version as it is now recommended to the Council of Ministers. And so another lessons learned, or it's always the same, institutionalization is a continuous process, and it's not just done with one document. This is kind of the very first document ever that a basin organization has developed such a guideline document. And the member states say as well, let's take it from here. Let's first see how this might influence our work, how this might help us to develop more projects. And then there might still be possibilities to maybe agree on more strong language of documents, or even reach out to another form of document. And then the final point, as I said, the Niger Basin Authority is a basin organization, is dominated by the water sector. And this as well would take long to really overcome and have a fully WEFE governance structure. But still, this way of going more into the national states and having the national representatives from different ministries allowed us to get a bit more of a balanced sectorial representation here. Though the key decision makers in the end, in the ministries who foresee kind of the NBA, remain the water ministries. And so this will not be changed within a short time. Yeah, with this, thanks a lot. For any context, please reach out either to me or to my colleague, Dr. Musa Ibrahim, who's coordinating this work with me. And with this, back to Annabelle.
Thank you so much, Robert, and also to Ellie for contributing and letting us know about your experience. Quite a process. And I think, yeah, the duration of the project also shows that we need so much time when we have so many actors and interests and countries. So I encourage everyone to switch the camera on again. We go for the public debate. Please note your questions in the chat function. And I will start with a question to Robert because that fits very well just right now. What governance challenges they encountered, so you encountered during the WEFE Nexus implementation, and can you share a good practice of handling such an issue? So the presentations we have had were a bit on the lessons learned level and on the handling level, but I think we need more practice. We need more of getting a feeling of what the real stakes are, what the real interests are, what the difficulties are, and how you overcome them. So maybe you can give some examples.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Big question to say, what are the governance challenges?
Yeah, maybe just a few examples. I mean.
So one example, this comes back maybe as well to the issue of strong language. We have to consider that all of the main participants come from an IWM background, and in essence, we're kind of hesitant now. So how would Nexus now change this? And they said, if we still want to have purely water project, would now this guideline kind of stop us here? And this is something we kind of tried to overcome, saying, no, it's still possible to have on the definition that we gave. It's still possible as well to have just a pure drinking water project, if at least you make sure that there's no negative impact on the other sectors. This is still possible, but you can see that people remain a lot in their silos first, saying it's great if we have synergies, but still I won't be able to continue a bit the way I did it before. Maybe I have a project in mind and I still want to be able to conduct this project. So maybe this is one answer in this direction. Maybe another, what we try to do is always give an example on how this guideline could be applied. And we always took one national project from every country and always asked, so what is your kind of highly prioritized project? And those countries that are having dams always gave their dams. It said, so in Niger, for instance, there's a dam project, the Kandachi Dam, planned for 30 years. And then we tried to give some scenarios saying, okay, you're planning this dam, now you can prioritize. And this is what decision makers will do in the future. You can prioritize, do you want to use this mainly for the energy production, or do you want to use this as well for irrigation schemes? And how much do you want to allocate? And by doing this analysis, kind of giving them the feeling how decisions are interconnected, that's not possible to have a full hydropower generation and at the same time provide an irrigation scheme for, I don't know, all the population that's living in this area. So this was one way maybe to showing how decisions can be reflected.
Yeah, thank you. That makes it much more concrete, and I think also already answers this question on specific examples of synergies, whether the Nexus approach does make a difference. One last follow-up question on that before we come to the other presentations. So Robert, what are the specific examples of binding language that different sectors or states may fear in the agreement? What expectations do these different states may have in terms of this new Nexus approach? So I think it's also, I mean, is it just a guideline we sign and everybody's happy, or does it really bind us to something that will follow then?
So we had in the end some legal advice from a professor from the University of Ouagadougou, Professor Amidou Garané, who as well was involved in the drafting of the Water Charter of the NBA. And he reminded us that for actually having a full binding document ratified by all member states, this should go up to the head of states, because it's not even the ministries that can have them, the water ministries that can sign a kind of directive document, which then has national implications for all 9 member states. So at this point, it was already clear, okay, it's not even possible in the scope of work now to have such a binding document. It would have been something compared to the Water Charter, where we said it should be a compendium to the Water Charter. But still, there were some hesitations, and first formulation was this document relates to all projects developed in the basin. And there was this fear, okay, we really understand this WEFE approach, but maybe there's another approach in 2 years and somebody comes in and let's say wants to work particularly now on the context on conflict and climate change. And why should we now relate everything that we do only to this WEFE approach? And so this is one hesitation that they brought up. We always said, well, we never say that this approach should be kind of topping everything else or replacing even IWM. It's just they can be good even in can be well done together, but still this hesitation was there. This is why there was some kind of weaker formulation, like saying these projects can be applied in the basin, which makes a big difference from a legal perspective.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's a really a great experience that hopefully you can also bring in other Nexus projects of GIZ or anywhere.
And it doesn't end with this.
Yeah.
So it's not just a document.
I would like to catch up with Rebecca and Srini with another question. It was directed to Rebecca, but I think it also concerns Srini. What are the best mechanisms to support cross-sectoral institutional collaboration that have been identified, especially to help ensure participation and accountability? So Rebecca, maybe you can start.
Yeah, I guess I can start by saying I think it's really important to consider the enabling environment of any initiative that's set up, and what kinds of conditions are being created in order to enhance this cross-departmental or cross-institutional collaboration. So there, I think there's the correct frameworks need to be set up for the engagement and coordination of who exactly is going to be involved, and you know, what kinds of mechanisms are going to be in place in the case that institutional disputes occur, or who exactly is going to be included in what kinds of conversations. And I think it's really important to identify from the very beginning which stakeholders from which sectors are going to be involved and in which capacity, and doing that in a participatory manner means considering from the onset who is going to be involved in the process. Yeah.
And the mechanisms you work on, they are situated at different levels, right? Does it go from the local project until the national level, or where is it usually placed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly important to have those frameworks in place at the national and the regional level. Certainly, it requires participation and inclusion and dialogue with local stakeholders, for sure. That's an essential element of any of this, and especially when it comes to participation, who are the beneficiaries, who is going to be affected by any of these projects, and are they included in the conversation, and what kinds of accountability mechanisms are in place in order for them to be able to consistently assure that that project is doing what it's supposed to. And for that, it requires a constant dialogue with those who are really going to be affected by the project at the end of the day.
Yeah, sure. So Srini, it's not so much about participation and accountability, but yet about efficiently addressing the WEFE Nexus. So what good mechanisms did you identify to support cross-sectoral collaboration?
Yeah, I think I'm going to approach this issue from the other side. I mean, like, of course, let's say that, okay, we have discussed a lot about the mechanisms, like these coordination mechanisms, these platforms and basin councils. I mean, these kind of mechanisms which were in place? I mean, like, for example, IWRM and so on, no? So I think besides having them in place at the national, at regional levels, I think it is also important to understand what makes them effective. I think beyond having them in place, for example, I mean, let me take the recent case study example of Malawi. They've been having National Water Resources Act and Water Resources Master Plan developed with the help of JICA. But I think what we have seen after almost 10 years is that we don't have a representation of Water Resources Authority at the local level, and still, I mean, as mentioned in the conclusions, it is the governance regimes and the administrative boundaries, which are more effective in deciding how the resources are being used. And in order to consider this cross-sectoral collaborations beyond the national level, in the sense beneath the national level, I think it is also important to understand what capacities are required and how to make these plans effective. You could add another dimension today and another dimension tomorrow to this existing integrated frameworks. But I think what becomes more important is what are the conditions? I mean, I think Rebecca mentioned, okay, the enabling conditions. So unless we address these crucial enabling factors, I think they will always, I think, will always end up with the same challenges. Of course, that does not mean that we should stop and then so on, but I think we should also simultaneously think about how we break this boundaries, and of course we have like basin level committees and so on, but we see that decisions are more effective decisions are taken by administrative boundaries. And for example, as Robert mentioned, water sector is more prominent and more powerful in some country, but whereas in other countries it could be energy, or it could be agriculture, like which rules the roost, and then and which are more powerful, and where drinking water is neglected and other uses are more prominent. So you cannot have one mechanism for all the contexts. Yeah, sorry. I think the context and the enabling factors are the keywords here for me.
Okay, thank you so much. I would take another question, comment and question directed to Robert. Really interesting presentations. That's for all. Thank you. It was great to hear about the inclusion of upstream and downstream connections and stakeholders in the Niger Basin project. I wonder how far this is extended. Did this include coastal and marine stakeholders, or only freshwater and land-based actors? Robert.
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is a topic which is not really now new regarding the WEFE Nexus, but this is something that the NBA is kind of working on for years. And yeah, this includes as well coastal marine actors, as long as they belong to the basin, though this is, in the case of the Niger Basin, just now the delta in Nigeria. It is not such a big topic maybe than for the other countries. So there is not that much coastal marine part of the basin. But of course, this is kind of their day-to-day business, managing trends, boundary aspects, and particularly if I take again the example of this Kandaji Dam in Niger, there were a lot of negotiations between Nigeria and Niger on what should be the remaining flow level of the river, as Nigeria already has two larger dams on their side. They had a lot of, they were afraid a lot on how this big dam now in Niger would impact you. So this is what they do for a long time, but now adding kind of this in the cross-sectorial perspective, this is something kind of new, that even now the hydropower project in one country could impact on the irrigation scheme of another country. So there it becomes complex, because then not only between two countries, but it's between different ministries in the two countries, and then coordinating this by kind of one structure. Needs a lot of time work, but this is actually where this work should lead to, and where we hope that the different representatives realize that this coordination is needed. I hope this answered is.
I suspect so. So otherwise the person can write in the chat again. Thank you. Another question to Srini. Sorry, it switched off. Does Dr. Srigiri refer to downscaling the governance system to smaller scale with IWRM strategies to make policies more effective? Or how do we actually include end users or local communities in governance scheme to make it more effective? So I think there's a fear of losing this local perspective and needs once you upscale it too far.
Yeah, I think what Ali mentions is, I mean, something closer to what I meant. You know, it's we have to consider how to make these IWRM strategies more effective. I mean, like there's a lot that can be learned from by the new WEFE Nexus approach from the experiences of IWRM on what was effective in terms of including end users and yeah, how can we make the participation of local users more effective and so on. No, so inclusion of other users and so on. So that's a good way, you know, like to to learn from the existing experiences of IWRM and how to include the local perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's something we also see in two other questions directed probably to you, Robert. So what happens at the level of the farm and the stream, and also how stakeholders affected by planned projects are then integrated into Nexus assessments?
Yeah, thanks a lot as well for this question. In the presentation, I just showed the structure of the guideline document and the roles and responsibilities. And I said, so there's not the idea now to create any new sub-basin committees on the different WEFE sectors, but what is already in place, and what I feel as well is quite effective already, is on the one hand, there are structures that are called the national focal structures that should combine the different national representatives, so different ministries, but then as well in every country as kind of a sub-organ there is the coordination of the users of the natural resources of the basin. So this is kind of a civil society representation of different user groups. This can be herders, this could be fishermen, this could be farmers, and of course they might not have to reach out to really represent all single farmers, but at least they are kind of a formal representation towards then the decision makers and the ministries, bringing in the voice of the users, and they are representative at every meeting, at the regional meeting, at the Council of Ministers. They are always there. They always have their voice, at least through their representatives. And if we look as well in the way that projects are developed in the Niger Basin, they always have quite an important role. So mainly the projects are then about these beneficiaries, how should they benefit from the work? And so we said, this is actually the structure where we can build on. So there's no need now to have kind of the WEFE sub-basin organization, but these representative, this coordination of user groups, they should be the one that bring in then the different considerations of impacts of one project and should be heard here. And the tools kind of or the different responsibilities are kind of listed. And yeah, they should be taken into consideration there.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Rebecca, I wonder actually, when we have massive investments in Nexus projects, such as dams and the other infrastructures, of course, we have a huge risk of corruption, which we all know, not only from developing countries, but also from the European world, for instance. So how do you proceed concretely? I'm wondering, it must be, I mean, we need support from public policies, but at the same time, we often have vested interests in the private sector that are also represented of people sitting in public policy. So how do you actually proceed in combating corruption in this field?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to having the right tools and mechanisms in place that address these different risks for corruption. I mean, there's not one catch-all solution, right, to stopping corruption at every level, but rather it happens in many different ways, and you need different mechanisms and different support systems in place, as it were, to address these different challenges that come up. But like, for example, in a Nexus project, you can ensure that there's budget transparency. You can ensure that there's internal and external audits being taken place at a regular frequency. You can develop tools for pre-screening WEFE Nexus investment projects, but absolutely, investment-related risks are, I think, some of the highest in Nexus. In Nexus projects because of just the amount of capital that's going into these projects, but I think they need to be addressed, yeah, with their corresponding tool.
Okay.
And I would say that you know, WIN has done a lot of work to assess what are these risks in the development, particularly in the development of water-related infrastructure, and we're working actually on an infrastructure project at the moment, but for each risk that's happening, what kind of solution can be applied.
Yeah, not only different type of risk, but I'm really impressed also about your country structure. You're present in so many countries, so I encourage everyone to also have a look at your website if they want to catch up with representatives in the different countries. So maybe one last question to Robert. I want to know whether the mandate of NBA also has something to do with the development around Chad Basin or Lake Chad. One significant example of devastating effect of climate change is the drying up or shrinking of Lake Chad, which has had devastating impact on the livelihood of people in the area. So is there any step taken by the NBA to address this?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm not a Lake Chad expert, but first, I mean, these are two different basins. So formally, NBA has nothing to do with the Lake Chad. For the Lake Chad, there's Lake Chad Basin Commission. So there's an own commission working on between Cameroon, Chad, Niger, Nigeria. But and sometimes if you look at governance, sometimes it comes down to people. And for instance, the same national focal coordinator for Niger for the NBA is the same for the Lake Chad Basin Commission. And this true as well, for instance, for Nigeria. So there's the same people meet if they come to the I don't know, annual meeting of NBA, the same people that sometimes come then together for the annual meeting of the LCBT. Now, and actually there is some cooperation as well between the two basin organizations. And there's another project as well done by GIZ in this region, which is called Nexus. So it's kind of taking this Nexus approach and try to apply it particularly in the context of climate change and conflicts. And this makes it Nexus in fragile context, which translates then to Nexus. Long story, but they particularly work as well with the Lake Chad Basin Commission and particularly look at the impacts. How does now climate change maybe impact on local farmers, on transhumans and different practices, and how does this relate maybe to new emerging conflicts? So this is a topic which is relevant to the LCBT, but as well to the NBA and both kind of basin organizations exchange on this. But formally, NBA is not kind of responsible for what's happening in the Lake Chad Basin.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you point to the importance of informal networks also, because sometimes these people, the people overlap. So I'm sure there's also a lot of exchange going on. Well, I think we can continue a couple of minutes and take these two very final questions. So we get back to the local communities. Is there a way that local communities can show a level of implementation, a tool to promote transparency in all levels and to ensure accountability? Rebecca, maybe you could give an example of a tool, how communities are involved in creating transparency, accountability.
Yeah, I think perhaps something like you know, mechanisms to report and denounce wrongdoing would be a good example. So reporting mechanisms that involve communities, that communities are able to actually get involved in a project and be able to report wrongdoing if that's something that's occurring is a good example. And I think it's also a way in which communities can be involved in a project from the onset. Is one tool that comes to mind. I don't know if Robert, you have any like kind of concrete examples of something that's come up in Niger River Basin.
So that really with tools, we always imagine kind of having the magic toolbox. It comes down for me a bit to the conception of a project. These are kind of mechanisms that you can design in a project about reporting, for instance, about how should be local representatives, local beneficiaries be represented in the project, and are they taking part, for instance, at the steering committee meeting, or where can their voice be heard? So I couldn't now name a specific tool, but it really comes down on how to develop or design a project and the participation of local users.
Yeah, I mean, in reference to a previous question, which is a little bit related, is I responded that you know, promoting and supporting local communities, co-management of projects can also be one tool. If they're involved in that process from the very beginning, then it's more likely that they're able to also understand if a process is being conducted in a transparent manner or not, and if those that are carrying out the project are being accountable or not. And that co-management starts with their voices and their interests and their needs being included from the onset.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, beyond the question of communities, of course, it's always difficult to bring the sectors together. I mean, we know in almost every country, like water and agriculture, water and energy. So do you have good recipes for this? There's a question, how can accountability be ensured across sectors that may not feel accountable to each other? And often, of course, they all have a different political standing also. So any positive examples that we can learn from? I suppose it's in the planning process where it has to come together already. Okay, so sorry, I'm just following the chat to see this final remark. So WIN has posted that they have the integrity management toolbox that you can check up online, and different accountability mechanisms. And I think everyone is also happy to stay in touch and provide more insights. So you know our institutions. If you were looking for an email address, you can also contact me. I'll be happy to forward the contact details of all speakers. So thank you all for your participation. Thanks a lot to the panelists, and a big thank you also to Binayak and Kaustab from WIN, who organized and enabled this event, and hope to see you soon back again for the next Bonn Water Network events. And of course, enjoy the weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
So good.
Do you guys want to touch base just on a separate call on Microsoft Teams?
Sorry?
Do you want to touch base just quickly on a separate call on Microsoft Teams?
Okay. Yeah, we can.